Hello. I'm happy. This is Dylan McCain Allen from YMP Orlando's Board of Directors. I am a co-chair of the Programs Committee and very happy to bring a recap episode of one of my favorite podcast episodes with one of my favorite podcasts. That's Nonprofits Are Messy with Joan Gary. If you might remember from a few years ago, YMP in Orlando read a book by Joan Gary on nonprofit leadership. And so this podcast is a bit of a workshop for nonprofits that she does every week. She brings out amazing speakers from across the country to talk about boards, development, working and supporting with small nonprofits, those small but mighty nonprofits, as she says, and working around a lot of different issues, whether it be fundraising or volunteer engagement or marketing, branding, change management, and as well as bringing more equity and diversity into nonprofits, and also ways to focus bigger on the mission, such as with outcomes measurement. It's a really excellent podcast. I highly recommend, and in particular, this episode to talk to today. In line with the theme of actualizing anti-racism in the social sector, YMP in Orlando is excited to bring up the conversations that this particular episode started to evoke across the country. Now, community-centric fundraising, which is the central theme of this episode, is something that has bubbled up over the past few years. It's something that a number of leaders of color and particularly fundraisers and executives of color within the nonprofit sector have been talking about for years, but haven't really had the language or the structure and form to talk about how to make fundraising a little better. So myself as a professional fundraiser and a grants professional, I found that entering in this podcast, when I first listened to it, it aired about a year ago in July of 2020. So think through everything that was happening in the country around July 2020, from the pandemic to the death and murder of George Floyd to protests and calls for reconciliation and just a general better approach to how we tackle systemic and structural racism in the country. It was the right time as any to be able to bring up the forefront the conversations that this episode aired. I strongly recommend that you go through it and watch it and give it a listen. But for the purposes of simplicity, if you don't have time for the full thing, I'll go ahead a quick recap of some of the things that were discussed in that today. That way you have about 5-10 minutes just to go ahead and gloss through. And that way you can join us tonight at 6:30 p.m. at the Gatherings for Good, which is every last Tuesday of every month. It is going to be done virtually for the moment in time being, since our community is ravaged by the coronavirus pandemic. So to dive right in, Joan Gary, mind you, is a long executive director in the nonprofit sector, but actually coming from media. So she has an interesting perspective where she is somewhat of a newbie, only been working in the nonprofit sector for about the past 10 or so years. He previously worked at MTV as a producer. And so working in media companies is an interesting lens of kind of the public side of what nonprofits look like, and then jumping into it and navigating that world. And she's very excited to have the conversations with her guests, Vu Le and Michelle Murray, who are co-founders of the movement that is the Community-Centric Fundraising movement. Vu Le worked a lot with, you may know his work around the Nonprofit AF blog. It's a really funny, really engaging, and really powerful way to keep in touch with the ways that nonprofits are working. I follow them and read almost every blog that he puts out every single week. And Michelle Murray has been doing a lot of this work around activism and coaching and strategic work with nonprofits for quite some time as well. So a lot of this podcast was less of actionable things to take away, but rather actionable questions to bring to your organization, and a lot of reflection. And they're very clear that this is not prescriptive in any way. Mind you, that this whole movement, I mean, the website, community-centric fundraising, the conversations around community-centric fundraising had only begun last year. So while there has been light talkings about, the framework for common verbiage just started. And they're quite blunt in this episode that there's going to be changes, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be ways and areas that they mess up and that they fail at. And that level of authenticity is important to them as they look to seek and ground fundraising in a much more equitable manner and a much more efficacious manner to missions. They ask the question, really, when we think about such as a major gifts program, historically and currently, that is very largely centering in a white dominant space. And understanding that most major donors in the United States are white. And there's certain degrees and areas of whiteness that comes around in grant seeking and individual donor program development and even peer-to-peer marketing aspects. And so they challenge us to think through what are the motivations to give, what does the power dynamic of the donor look like, and how does that affect the mission. So they give a lot of really interesting stories to bring this conversation into kind of helm. And I think that Vu had a good job of kind of alluding to what, in his mind, the three takeaways of community-centric fundraising were: to move from a thankful paradigm into a justice paradigm. He tells a story of his little toddler, he and this toddler working in the backyard and planting some seeds. And so his little toddler grabs a little seedling and just runs away with it and plops it in the soil and kind of chimps on back, gets all excited, like, look, I planted a seed, and everything in nonprofits have taught us, like, that's amazing, that's great, awesome, that's fantastic, we're so happy for you. But if you look behind the toddler, he trampled over like 6 other seedlings that were already planted and growing. And so, like, in the nonprofit mindset, it was like, write him a thank you letter, thank you so much, really appreciate you being here. But instead, no, I mean, you may have planted one seed, but in the process you destroyed 6. So what are the everyday behaviors that the philanthropists conduct that might be harming the very mission of the work that we do? You may support some work for job training, but if your actual internal policies are making it so that people need to leave your job to get a higher wage over here, then you're making the problem worse even with your philanthropy. And so that was a shocking moment, and Joan Gary was very forthright and sympathetic to the viewers who were listening to this and saying, wait, I have to now that I finally found a potential donor that I just really need $1,000, then move on to the next one, but now you want me to examine their wealth? So that was kind of a next point that Michelle really focused on, and really is moving from a mindset of unexamined wealth to examined wealth. The way that she had described the two and thinking through is, in the unexamined side, she knows has a friend and colleague who had been working with an organization, rather a philanthropist, not an organization, a philanthropist whose father had passed away, and whose father had created this chemical that was, I believe, used in agriculture, but it was really to the detriment of the community, created fetal abnormalities, still to this day creates birth defects, can cause deaths in both children and in still lived communities. And so there's literally, this multi-billion-dollar family that has literally, their funds are blood money, and how it is rummaged over the communities that particular chemical has hurt. And the mindset of the philanthropist was, I want to give away I want my kids to have 75% of my gift, but I believe in the community, so I want to give back 25% of my bequest towards community work. And in her mind was, I mean, that sounds nice and all, but if you think about it, almost the entirety of your wealth was built on blood. Don't you feel that the people that you've hurt are owed in due the money that you have reaped from their livelihoods? That's unexamined wealth moving along into examination. An example of examined wealth practices are when another philanthropic organization in the country had raised a lot of their wealth off of the backs of the railroad company, and which had included eliminating and removal and harsh pushing off, as well as the death of many indigenous communities, and pushed them off their land, stole the land, and not to mention the killing, and not to mention the on the backs of Asian slave workers. And so when they started to have conversation of this money is blood money, like all this wealth that we have to redistribute out into the world is coming from an immense amount of pain that still to this day we perpetuate through our giving. That's when you would see. So this organization stepped back and actually decided to give 60% of their their dollars that they donate every year towards indigenous communities. So that's moving towards an examination of wealth and then how it came into accrue and building back that justice mindset. And then the third point that they come to is the donor desires cannot supersede the community needs. So one example that was brought up was this time where Vu was speaking to a nonprofit leader who was just frustrated that had some donors come in and say, like the donors were coming to meet students, and I believe that this mentorship program and this high school students of color just didn't really like having like all these people in business suits walk in the classroom while these students are just in their school wear, their everyday wear. Created this big power dynamic, and the students themselves asked for this to change. And so the nonprofit asked the donors, would you please stop wearing these suits? And the donors said, this is what I wear in my work attire, my day to day. This is where I'm more comfortable, and I really want to do this. And he's like, well, we got to do with what the donors want to do. And Vu was like, no, we have to push back on that mindset. We're here to support the community, not support the brand of the donors. And if we're here to choose, we like literally in a moment like that where we choose our mission or our donors, and we choose their donors, I'll ask is, what are we doing here? And so it's one of those things that we really have to examine the ways that we may be trotting along and kind of rummaging over the seedlings of our mission and the people that we are supposed to serve and represent. This podcast really asked a lot of really hard hitting questions in such a variety of ways. They held, before they came on for this podcast, Vu and Michelle had led a Seattle-based conference where they had about 90 fundraisers and nonprofit executives of color. And the biggest two things that they had found from this conference was that they were frustrated at the way philanthropy and fundraising works in the sector, finds that it is actually harmful to the mission, harmful to the organization, harmful to the communities, not to mention harmful for their own personal wellness. But at the same time have long felt alone and unable to speak out that truth. And without the community, there's never been a platform for folks to move forward, to think, how might we do these things differently? Now, they're thankful to the donor-centric model for a lot of important points. To an extent, gratitude is important. To an extent, empathy is important. But don't let empathy turn into poverty porn. Don't let this gravitation towards gratitude to thank people and make them kind of expect that they are elevated and are doing the best possible thing they could through all the thankfulness. And an example Vu gives of with his husband, that imagine if every time that I did the dishes, my husband wrote a card saying, hey, thanks, you're an amazing part of this community. This family wouldn't be here without you. You have made a difference today. What if like his kid wrote little letters, thank you for the lunch that you made me and the breakfast and the dinner and every little thing. I mean, those are just expected of being a husband and a father. And at some point, like it's totally fine to show gratitude, that like, thank you for being a part of this, but also it's a part of building a better sense of the importance of this work and really educating donors on what this could look like. One example that Vu mentioned out was that he knows of, he and Michelle had done community-centric fundraising workshops with boards. Also mentioned another nonprofit had sent out a book on and grappling with systemic racism to all of their major donors and invited them to a book club. This can look in a lot of different ways, and they're honest, like it's gonna ruffle feathers. In one of those instances during the workshop, one of the board members who was a major donor said, I am offended about this, and then they left and took their gift with them. But understand too that a component with this is elimination of the nonprofit hunger games, this scarcity mindset, and a perpetuation of something called an abundance mindset. This here is a different form for nonprofits to think through community change making in a more collaborative manner. And an example to that was when Vu had a donor said, I'm looking for a nonprofit that does something that you're not doing. He said, I know someone who could help. Introduce them to that board member, to a not board member, to a nonprofit executive, another organization. And he's worried, I'm worried because it's going to send his gift away. But I really do feel that if this is something that he matters to him, then they should have the opportunity to explore. Turns out the donor gave a gift to both organizations, and now the other executive director sends people to him. We find that when folks feel too, if you think about being able to create a collaborative environment and just build up a greater, for example, you care about education, rather than supporting one education organization, you can create a better ecosystem for education in the community. So there's a lot of different ways that challenge a lot of the assumptions that we as fundraisers felt that we always had to live by as tenants. And once again, this podcast by no way is intended to definitively prescribe do this, that, and this, and then racism's over or systemic injustice of any marginalized community is over, but rather it gets us to reflect about the whole cycle of our mission, including the flywheel. It's a very powerful episode that will evoke a lot of thinking. And if you are interested in this kind of conversation, have some ideas to share, or want to learn more, there are actual practical steps. So tonight at 6:30 p.m., I invite you to join myself and YMP Orlando's Vice Chair and Development Chair, Sophie Granville, will be joining me at 6:30 p.m. That's tonight on Facebook and YouTube Live. Join us from either. And if you want to learn more before or after tonight, I invite you to check out community-centricfundraising.org or listen to Michelle Murray's The Ethical Rainmaker podcast. Both will gather a ton of insight on this entire new field of discussion, but also community-centric fundraising does have specific principles and actions that you can take to at least either think and learn and grow, or to incite reflection, if not change, in your own organization. Thanks so much, and we'll see you tonight.